Punctuality. This interview was supposed to begin at 10 a.m. this morning. And Rajesh being Rajesh, he was in 2 minutes earlier. We got ourselves warmed up, and here we are, 10 a.m. on the dot spot, starting this, what I hope will be a series of 2 talks, maybe more as we go along, where you get to know Rajesh Jain. Now, a minute, who is Rajesh Jain? Let's understand that a minute. Let's just pause here, just silence me for a minute. Look up Rajesh Jain on the internet. Find his blogs, say Rajesh Jain blogs. Find his two video programs, one called HippoBrain and the other called MartechBrain, and both of them are absolutely fascinating. Look at his LinkedIn profile. Do yourself a favor and look at a news story way back in 1999, which is when I first heard of Rajesh Jain, where we were doing a company and we promptly rechristened it. It was called Custom Asset. We promptly rechristened it customasset.com because Rajesh Jain had shown us the way. Now, with that introduction, I hope you paused me. I hope you've done this research, or if you didn't need to do the research before, let's launch right into it. Rajesh, I must admit, this is my first time I'm interviewing somebody. So I'm a little nervous. I'm usually at the other end where I'm being interviewed. Now, so I must apologize if I do a bad job of it, because you deserve better. You are somebody whom I've got tremendous respect for, Rajesh. And with that, let's start with a little introduction to Rajesh Jain in Rajesh Jain's words.
Ajay, I have to thank you a lot. I think you've turned the tables on me in this MartechBrain series. Really appreciate it. I think no one's come to me with the idea that, oh, instead of me interviewing someone, I should get interviewed. Really appreciate it. Let's get started.
Great. So can you tell me about yourself? I mean, who is Rajesh Jain? Just try and let's answer that question.
Sure. So I look at myself as a serial entrepreneur, and it's now in two spaces. There's part of me which does work in the technology space, and there's part of me in the last 10 odd years who's been working in the political and what I call prosperity space. So I'm a serial tech entrepreneur and a serial political and prosperity entrepreneur, but essentially an entrepreneur at heart, which means I fail many more times than I succeed.
So clearly that's the first thing you're used to saying when somebody says, who is Rajesh Jain? Now let me ask the question again. Who is Rajesh Jain?
Okay. So Rajesh Jain is a guy who basically grew up in Mumbai. Most of his life, he was a quiet guy in the early years. Went to school at St. Xavier's High School in Bombay, St. Xavier's College. And then came my admission to IIT Bombay, which sort of opened me up completely. Those 4 years I spent there were amazing years. They made me bolder. They showed me a world outside of academics. And then I went to the US, spent a few years there, came back to India, like my father had done 25 years before me. He had said, Rajesh, finish your master's in 9 months, work 2 years and come back, which is exactly what I did. And that started my journey on as an entrepreneur. And there are a few things which, when I look ahead now, which sort of drive me. One is, how can I grow Netcore into a $1 billion proficon? In my life, I've never raised money, and I coined a word some months ago, proficon. We'll, I'm sure, talk about that at some point. Then how do we put India on the path to prosperity? That's another thing which has driven me for the past many years, that Indians don't need to be poor. Other countries have become rich and prosperous. What can we do to make India on that path, put India on that path? And the third is, how can I use the wealth that I have and hopefully will generate for creating institutions in the socio-political space. I mean, we have seen a lot of US people like from Carnegie, who built the libraries, the think tanks built by some of the great US leaders. Can we create something like that in India? So institutions that last way beyond me. So those are three driving things, and a lot of what I do, I keep these three things in mind, and I believe entrepreneurship is what I can do well. Starting up on new initiatives, new ideas. A lot of them fail, but that's, I think, part of life. That's how one learns. That's what I like doing. So every day I get up and say, how can I do things a little better? How can I be a little better person than I was yesterday?
Okay, I'm now going to ask the question a third time. This time, who is Rajesh Jain? This time, I'm going to give you my impression before you start, right? Uh, I've read a lot of your writing and I've interacted with you. And what and I've known you by reputation, of course, for many, many years. And the impression that I had of you and what I've discovered since we've got to know each other is that you are primarily a teacher and a learner. You're hugely curious and very, very respectful of other people's learnings on the one hand, and yet you have so much to share on the other. So when I'm thinking about who's Rajesh Jain, I'm thinking, yeah, sure, he's an entrepreneur. Yeah, sure, he made some money. Yeah, sure, he built some companies. But there's so much more, isn't there?
Very nicely put, Ajay. I couldn't have framed it better. Um, you know, I started writing uh, in about 97 or so. Uh, I started with a column in Indian Express on the internet, 96 or 97. And they'd give me a full page. That's when I discovered that I could write. So every 2 weeks, I had to fill up 1,500 words. And it was wonderful seeing my name in print, internauting. And I have to thank Venkatesh Hariharan for actually doing that. And then that love for writing and sharing actually has stayed through the years. Um, I wrote every day on my blog, first at emergic.org till about 2012. Then I stopped for 7 years. And I think which was a big mistake when I look back, because I started work on the political side and I didn't want that to interfere. And I could not be open with what I was doing. I had to, because I was working for Modi at that time. And I didn't want my writings to interfere with the campaign for the first few years. And then I just stopped. And then I restarted in April this year, April 2020. And I realized I love writing so much. I don't worry about how many people will read it. I write for myself. It helps me clear my own thoughts. And uh, writing also actually makes you curious and learn. And my discipline is to write something new every day. I used to do that for the first 12 years of my writings, and I've done the same thing now. And I think one has to, there's so many interesting people, there are so many interesting things to learn. And every conversation actually teaches us something if we can spend a little bit of time reflecting. And that's how we become better. We learn, we become better. And if we can make that into a daily discipline, into a sort of iterative cycle, I think it's a very powerful flywheel that we can create for ourselves individually.
I'm glad you brought that one up. Do you think there's a flywheel to learning? I'll give you a simple example. I reviewed your article on velvet rope marketing. And thank you so much for quoting me. I appreciate that. But what's far more important to my mind is you seem to have been doing this for what, a year or two now? Velvet rope marketing and thinking like that?
Yeah, about the last year or so, 8-9 months.
Okay, so what I was blown away by, I've been doing this for what, 30 plus years, right? The way you captured it was incredible. And I just want to spend a minute on this models which you used to think. Because when you're learning, you're obviously learning far more efficiently than I am. I mean, it took me 30 years to figure it out. You've done it in a year or a few months, right? So what's the difference? I mean, how is your thinking? How do you slot things into these mental models which clearly seem to work so well for you?
So the short answer is I stand on the shoulders of giants like you. I aggregate ideas from others. But I'll tell you how I tend to do that. And I've done that many times in my life. One thing I like is, learning about new areas, new disciplines. And uh, if you had asked me a year ago, I had probably no concept of um, what really loyalty or CRM or ideas like velvet rope marketing were. uh, one of the habits I have is basically buying books. So I buy a lot of books. I don't necessarily read all of them. My belief is that every time I buy a book, there's a date which is there hidden in there, and the day when I'll open it and read it. So on one of my visits to the US, to Strand Bookstore in New York, um, I bought this book by on customer centricity by Fader, Peter Fader, Wharton professor, and it stood in my bookshelves for a long time. And then one day I just picked it up, and maybe I was thinking along something along those lines. This was about late last year, and I said these ideas are very interesting. So then what I did was I had a trip coming up in earlier this year in Jan to the US. So I just wrote to him. I didn't know him. I didn't have any connect. I just wrote to him saying that, look, I've read your book. I find the ideas interesting, and I'd like to come and meet you. Um, and he said, sure. I got a reply back in 24 hours saying that, look, if you're willing to come down to Wharton, I can spend an hour or so with you and we can talk about it. And I did that. I knew a half a day, I had 2 days in New York, but then half a day would go for this trip. But I said, I mean, here is a professor of 30 plus years. I mean, the wisdom that I will get from this trip will be infinitely more than just, me trying to think on my own. And that was exactly what happened. And so this kind of curiosity, I think I've always had this, that if one is willing to share ideas, it's what I call open sourcing ideas with other people, you actually get back a lot more. And I've done this even when I was doing my first company, India World. A lot of people would tell me that, why are you sharing your ideas, your business plan with others? And my point was that, look, the more no one can replicate and do what I'm thinking. My ideas are 1%. 99% is how I execute, the mistakes I don't make. But by sharing my ideas openly, I get actually much more from the other person, which enriches what I'm thinking. So the way of my way of learning is a mix of reading, conversations with smarter people in the field wherever possible, and third is then I write things down. So this is the thing, and I keep writing in my notebook, or I make notes to myself. And now through the blog, I also write publicly, because when I write, it again forces me to distill those ideas into something which is consumable by others. So this sort of cycle I find very, very helpful in this. I coined a phrase for it in a way, RLTW. So reading, listening, talking, and writing. Talking or thinking, it can be a mix of both. And that, I think, helps. And if you give yourself, I think, 6 months, it's possible to sort of learn a new discipline very well.
I think that's been very helpful indeed. But just, there's an underlying, okay, I'm going to put this bluntly, not to flatter, but just because I genuinely feel it. There's an underlying humility, which says, look, I'm always ready to learn. Now, I've known a lot of very successful entrepreneurs, and typically you're the smartest guy in the room. And even if you're not, you're quite convinced you are, because you've been right more of the time than other people have been right, which is why you've been so successful, right? With you, there's a certain humility, a willingness to listen, a willingness to learn, and listen very effectively and learn very effectively. Is that something which comes to you from your parents, or is it a religious thing, or is it, just the kind of person you are? I'm still on Who is Rajesh Shane, in case you didn't stop
that. Good question, Ajay. I think it's a mix of all of the above, I think. I grew up in a very sort of middle-class family, and we all saw tough times when we were growing up in the early years. And I think, in a way, the India of the 60s and 70s also, so it was sort of that milieu also. Prosperity was not easy. One had to work hard. One was never sure about future options in life. You had to work hard for that. And I think humility, I think, also links up with setting sort of ego aside. And I guess it's up to every individual, but what I've seen is that it's a mix of these two, three things coming together. That curiosity, I think, is very important. And we are very curious as kids, but somewhere as we grow up, we lose that ability to sort of ask questions of other people. And you'll only ask questions of other people if you're humble, like you said, if you're willing to show your ignorance. Um, and that then starts you off on a cycle. And today, the good thing is that through the internet, of course, there's a lot more ability to pick up new ideas. Um, and I've also been fortunate. I think that I've had good teachers in my life. I mean, I learned a lot about economics and how politics works in economics from Atanu, my friend in the US, a lot of politics in meetings with Narendra Modi between 2012 and 14. Uh, um, and I think if you're just willing to observe people, listen to them carefully, and like in my case, I tend to make a lot of notes in meetings, and then I reflect on that meeting afterwards. So I say, okay, if I sort of, the notes help me play back a meeting. What did I do right? What did I do wrong? What are the new things that came up in the conversation? How should my own mental models get modified based on what I have learned? And if we can build this into a daily cycle, I think the opportunities to become better and to learn more sort of is very, very powerful.
So let's just spend a moment on ego. I was reading your article about it in your blog. Let's because I think this is something which all of us have to work on, right? I mean, we're all born with a certain kind of ego, and some of us maybe are just born willing and wanting to learn and willing and wanting to be better, and others have to develop that. Let's just spend a minute on ego, and maybe we can talk about biases and thinking, and cognitive and non-cognitive biases which come from ego. So, would you like to spend a little and maybe give us a few examples from your own life so we can all learn from it?
So I think uh, I've seen a lot of people pulled down by their ego. And I think in my case, probably what happened was that I experienced a lot of failure in the early years when I came back to India. So I came back to India in 2012 after 4 years in the US. And I thought I was God's gift to the country. Um, a massive chip on my shoulder. I said IT education, US education, wanting to be an entrepreneur. And I thought nothing could go wrong. So I was quite arrogant at that time, or not very listening to people. Um, and what happened was the first 2.5 years, I pretty much failed at everything that I tried. And that's a very humbling experience. Um, the first few years, I was early 20s, and uh, company after company or effort after effort that I tried did not work. And then I said, and it's never easy accepting failure. When you think you're one of the sort of elite, you're born to be successful in some ways, or you're bred to be successful with the education that you've had. And that, I think, was a big changing experience. I think the other interesting period which helped change me was, I think, my first month in IIT. So you go into IIT, you think you're one of the smartest guys around. Okay, you've cracked JE, and you go to IIT, and the first month, and this is of course a different era. It was '84. Um, um, there's ragging, okay, and in a very friendly way. Okay, so I still remember my first night, and I had no idea what to expect. No one had prepared us for any of these things. I was Before I slept in my first night in IIT, I had sat in my underwear on a ledge between two rooms. I had cooked noodles for a senior, and it was 3 a.m. by the time I was led back into my room. And those things actually are great equalizers for your ego. Of course, you build amazing friendships also.
Absolutely.
And that's the reason why these things are done. But it basically brings you down to earth. It sets you on a level playing field. and you learn from others. I mean, that they are not bad people. They're just doing to break down the inhibitions that you have. We all come with hang-ups. We've never been away from home and so on. And uh, I think it's those mix of those early years early months in a way in IIT, the experiences after I came back from the US, which sort of helped transform me. And I think the early failures really, even today, so I've always looked at success and failure as two sides of the same coin. That, when you start something new, the default is failure. Okay, that the odds are that you're going to fail. And therefore, what are you going to do every day to reduce the chances of failure? That's really how an entrepreneur works. And I think in all of this, if you're not humble, if you don't set aside your ego, I think it's very, very difficult to actually succeed. And there are times when sort of I think I know best and I don't listen to other people. And inevitably, when I look back, those ventures actually have failed.
I guess none of us is as smart as all of us, kind of thing, right?
Very well put, Ajay. Absolutely.
I want to just spend a minute on this and ask you to give some advice, right? Because I'm hoping that as we go along, a lot of younger people watch this show. And a lot of those younger people will be versions of yourself and equally myself, who is always the smartest guy in the room, topped the class, went on to the IIM and then discovered the IIT in your case and discovered, oh my God, the guys are much, much brighter than I am out there. But then it's always reassured in your first job, you joined some kick-ass company and they all told you how smart you were. And, you were quite reassured until you went into entrepreneurship for the first time and came, nose to nose with reality. And that didn't work out as well as you hoped it would, right? But let's just imagine you could give advice to these youngsters and say, hey, how do you, without going through the pain of the experience, is there any way that they can think about, reducing ego in their decision making, being more humble?
I think one is when you start something, any new venture, just imagine the worst case scenario that's possible. See, what happens is every time we are all taught to be optimistic, and entrepreneurs by nature, Ajay, you know that very well also. We are all optimistic people. But if we actually think of the worst case scenario, that okay, 2 years down the line, I could fail, and this is how the world or the scenario looks at that time. I think that provides a very humbling backdrop to whatever you're going to do. I mean, sometimes it's hard to imagine. Sometimes you just have to go through it once to realize how difficult it can be. But I think that is very important, because see, what happens is that once you know that this is what the worst case scenario is, okay, you work very hard to avoid that scenario, and it sort of always is is something which you have to guard against in some way. So you want to make sure that doesn't happen to you. I think the other thing is that to avoid going down, sort of the path of ego and arrogance sort of coming in the way in any venture is, I think it's a person's nature in some ways, but it's also how do you approach problems. If you're open to listening, if you're open to sharing, I think, and you're open to going into a meeting saying that, look, I'm going to share my ideas and I'm going to be open to criticism. I'm going to be open to hearing what the other person basically tells me directly. And I still do that. If I do conversations or sometimes interviews or podcasts or even presentations, I'll ask people around me saying that, look, what could we have done differently? What could I have said differently? Could the outcome have been better? So I think it's just that self-reflection after every day or every meeting. And I tend to like to do that either at night or the next day morning. Just replay quickly the previous day. Spend some time thinking, because there's always a sixth sense in all of us. There's a gut sense. We know when we are doing something wrong. We know when we have made a mistake. If we start listening to that inner self of ours, I think we get we will actually know, that look, what I'm saying is not right. What I'm doing is not right. And then if we reflect back, why did I say that statement? Why did I maybe hurt another person? Why did I make a mistake? And then how do you face up to that? And if we build this cycle, I think it goes a long way in making us better. I think there's one more element which is there, and it's sort of a belief which my wife Bhavna has sort of drilled into me since my early days, and she's of course seen all my downs and the few ups. And her what she always says is that there's a good reason why anything happens. There's something good which will come out of everything, even though when you're living through the difficult periods, um, when you're living through these tough times, you feel, look, the world is about to end. Why is it happening to me? You feel anger. Okay, that I've done all the hard work. Other people are succeeding. Why am I failing? Um, but then when you look later, maybe 5, 6 months, you'll think about it and said, if that thing had not happened to me, I would not have been a better person. I would not have been a better situation. I'll give you one example, one story. Um, uh, India World as a venture, which I started in '94, came after probably 4 or 5 failures in the first 2.5 years. Now, I tried an image processing company, a multimedia database company. We tried a few other things in those first 2.5 years. When I look back, if any of those ventures had actually succeeded, I would not have done India World. I would have been focused on those ventures. Even in India World, we lost our domain, indiaworld.com. And I had to restart after a year and a half. And because we had to sort of restart, I came up with better names: samachar.com, khel.com, coach.com, bawarchi.com, which really became much, much bigger successes. And that would not have happened if the unfortunate event of losing indiaworld.com had not happened. So while it was happening, it's gut wrenching. You feel the world is sort of collapsing around you. So that's something which I've built in. And the first time it happened to me, my wife said, "Look, we'd go to office together, and this was in 95, 96. And on the way, she would go to the temple to pray, and I would sit in the car. I had a very big ego. I said, I don't need to talk to God or anything like that. And then when the bad things happened, she said, the only thing that can help you at this point of time is, why don't you just pray to God?" And I did that. I know it may sound very sort of, I don't know, facetious or whatever it is, but things changed. I mean, it's very hard to sort of define it in that manner. And it was very humbling again for me at that time, when I thought that there was no route, and there was no escape, that what I'd done had collapsed for the nth time again in my life. So I think if you're willing to set aside sort of the arrogance that is there within, and go to listen to other people, especially those around you who give feedback with no hidden agenda. All that they want to see is a better you. And if we listen to them, I think we can all do much, much better than we are normally capable of.
I think we have time for just one more question. I've got two, but pick either one. The first is, how do you know who to listen to and who not to listen to? Because some people are absolute idiots in their advice, some people are absolutely brilliant, and somewhere between those extremes are most of us.
Yeah.
The second question is, where do you find the grit to keep bouncing back again and again? So pick either one, and we'll take the other one when we start our next session.
Yeah, let's take the first one. How do you decide whom to listen to? I think each of us has a circle of friends around us. Okay, and these are relationships built over a very long period of time. And it's a call that we make. I mean, it's very hard to listen. It's not natural to someone gives you feedback in a meeting, you listen, but it's not with the same sort of depth that perhaps you'll listen to someone who's been with you for a long time. Sometimes it's family members, sometimes it's friends. But I think every one of us develops a sort of like there is this circle of competence that Warren Buffett talks about or Charlie Munger talks about. I think we all have a circle of friends. These are probably 5, 7, 8, 10 people whom we can be ourselves with. We don't have to put on any airs. We can ask them, and we should ask them, saying that, hey, you know what? Tell me how I can become better. Tell me what I've done wrong, what I'm doing wrong. Most of the times, we hesitate in asking because we are afraid of the answer that we are going to get in return. So that's why we don't ask. But if we can actually ask them, and they are people who will tell us, who know us better than perhaps we know ourselves. And if we just ask them, it's like holding a mirror to ourselves. I think it's wonders what that can do. So in my case, of course, there is the immediate family, my wife for the last 25 plus years, and she is very blunt with me. I mean, even if I don't want feedback, sometimes she'll give it to me. And initially, I used to be very sort of become very rigid, saying, how is she telling me like this? And then I realized she's always right. And when she says it, it means I've done something wrong and I have to become better. There is my friend Atano in the US, who's been a friend for now nearly 20 years, who's known me very well. And he gives me very candid feedback. My son now, who's 15, he doesn't hesitate to tell me like it is. Earlier, of course, my parents, and they still do that every once in a while. When I'm going down the wrong path, there are a few other friends. But I think it's just that you have to be open to listening. In Netcore, Kalpit, CEO, also my brother-in-law, he'll tell me after meetings, he's saying, look, you should not have said this is how you could have done it. He's younger to me. And yet I deeply value his inputs. So I think as long as we go in with this core circle, people who know us well, I think there's this constant cycle of improvement that we can actually develop by just listening to them.
You were very fortunate with Hemant Kothari giving you some very good advice, weren't you?
Oh, absolutely. And I think I still remember that the two things, the couple of things that he said when I was in two minds whether to sell India World when we got this offer of $100+ million. I think the key point he made really, 2 points I think which I will say is, first is, he said, Rajesh, more important than knowing when to enter a business is knowing when to exit. And the second point he said was that this is a great offer. Don't be so attached, because my wife and I, we had run this for 5 years. We're a team of 20 people. Our morning to night, our life was India World. He said, this is a great deal. The money which you will get from this will give you freedom to do the things that you truly want in life. And he says, I've seen you are a man of ideas, and you will go ahead and create new things. I mean, in those few meetings, he had seen me probably, or understood me better than I probably understood myself. Because for us, it was never about the money when we were building India World. And 20 years later, I think as I look back, he was absolutely right. The freedom that I got after that to try out new things. Not everything succeeds, a lot of things fail, but the freedom that is there is absolutely amazing.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's Rajesh Jain. We will continue this conversation in a few minutes from now. As we go along, feel free to ping me. I'm on LinkedIn, or Rajesh directly. He's also on LinkedIn. If you have any questions, follow-on questions, and you'd like us to incorporate that into future sessions that we might have. Rajesh, thanks so much. I have learned a lot, and I do hope the others have.
Thank you, Ajay.